Welcome, everybody. Today, we are kicking off a new podcast at CPG. It's going to be called the Supply Chain of Thought podcast. Today is our first episode, and we will be discussing the impact of tariffs on China sourcing and supply chains. I am here with CPG's CEO and founder, Michael de Clercq. He has been active in China sourcing since 1978. And with so much experience, he's seen the ups and downs of global trade. And today I'm going to be asking him some of the questions that many clients have been asking me recently in these uncertain times with a new administration. So welcome, Michael.
Hi, Laura. Thank you. And thank, everybody for attending. This is going to be fun. It's especially nice to be here with Laura. I know, Laura, that you spend a lot of time discussing sourcing and supply chain strategies with our clients. It gives you a very diversified and broad source of information. And these are indeed challenging times for importers. And I look forward to answering your questions as best I can.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for spending time with me today to discuss these topics. I do think they will be, it's going to be an important discussion for a lot of our existing clients and any company that is buying from China. Before we kick things off, I did want to clarify that Michael and I today will be using an IDS format that stands for Identify, Discuss, and Solve. So first we will identify the issue, which we've already shared, that is going to be the impact of potential increased tariffs on China. Then we will discuss some of the implications of this, and then finally present some practical solutions. So let's kick things off with the most important topic. Everyone's talking about this right now. There are potential 60% tariffs on goods imported from China. They could be as high as 60%. And should that happen, that would create an increasingly volatile environment for any company importing from China. And I'm curious, Michael, what do you think about these potential tariffs? Do you think they're actually going to go as high as 60%?
Well, Laura, that's the $1 million question, isn't it?
Yes.
So are these 60% tariffs going to happen? Are the 10% tariffs going to happen?
Right.
And nobody's got a crystal ball. And the point is, this is not up to us. It's not a question that relates to nature. It's a question that relates to politics. So in theory, yes, it could happen. The administration could impose tariffs of this magnitude. But in practice, I think it's a lot more complicated. And that, if you want, means that if you put yourself in the shoes of the administration, you have to ask yourself, what's in it for us? And the thing about tariffs, especially at the level of 60%, is that it would have significant economic downsides. And any administration needs to be mindful of having an adverse economic impact on the country.
Such as?
Well, if inflation goes up, you've seen what happened during the last elections. I think inflation might have been the most important topic. Mm-hmm. So most U.S. Elected officials like to be reelected, and they certainly, the thing about the American democracy system is that we really have a 2-year cycle because the midterms are coming in less than 2 years now. And people keep an eye on that. So I think before an administration goes ahead and imposes such draconian tariffs, they're going to need to carefully weigh the pros and cons of it.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. It's a valid point, and it's also what I have been hearing from our existing clients and other companies I engage with, that, if the tariffs on their China imports do increase, they are simply going to pass on those higher cost onto consumers in the form of higher prices. So I have been hearing that.
Yeah. And I mean, and I hear the opposite. I mean, I read the opposite in the newspapers. No, tariffs are not inflationary. China pays for the tariffs. And
I don't understand that logic.
well, I think the logic is, you know, you, the logic depends on timing. If you do a short-term tariff for 2 months, then maybe the suppliers and the importers are going to swallow it. But if that tariff pretty much becomes permanent, guaranteed they're going to pass the cost on.
And they usually do become permanent, don't they? I
Yeah, they
mean,
do.
it's how rare is it for them to be temporary?
Exactly. And people say they're going to be temporary, but in fact, it's much easier to impose tariffs than it is to remove them. And we've
Yeah.
seen this historically happen again and again.
Hmm.
So bottom line is that the tariffs are going to be long term, and the only way that um, the business people involved can survive them is if they pass the cost on,
Right.
and that's inflationary.
Right. So, even though we don't have a crystal ball, we can't read tea leaves, let's assume, though, that there is going to be a risk of increased tariffs for an indefinite period. Everybody wants to know, clients, companies buying from China, what should they do? There's a lot of talk of moving out of China. What's your take on that? Should companies reduce reliance on China, get out of China completely?
Well, okay, so I think again, before we come to the conclusion that tariffs are inevitable, um, let's look at one more thing. It's a trade issue, right? And it's also a mutually beneficial geopolitical issue. And by that, I mean, the other aspect, we spoke about inflation as an impact, but there's another impact, which is retaliation. The Chinese are going to say, fine, you're going to hurt me, I'm going to do my best to hurt you,
Right.
which means I'm going to buy less products from the United States. And
Hmm.
that has an impact. Not as large on the US economy as it would be on the Chinese economy, but it is an impact. And
Right.
finally, you've got the whole concept of uh, you know uh, commercial relationships with U.S. companies. If the U.S. administration imposes what the Chinese consider to be very unfriendly tariffs, well, they might retaliate by becoming very unfriendly to American companies that operate in China.
Right.
And that is a huge business. You're dealing with numbers in the range of $600 billion of sales made by American companies in China. So every time you think about those things, you think about, if you want, a lobby of people that basically get the ear of the administration and kind of tell them, yeah, don't do it or don't go too far. So I think it's important to keep that perspective before we get to the next question, because if the next question is, look, it's inevitable, we're going to have tariffs, and the tariffs are going to be huge, they're going to be 60%, you're going to have one answer. But if the tariffs are much smaller or perhaps temporary, you're going to have a different answer. But I assume your question had to do with what if the worst case scenario occurred, right?
Yes. So only recently there's been talk about only an increase in 10% tariffs on Chinese goods, goods
Mm-hmm.
imported from China. Prior to that, as we all know, there was talks of 60%. So we don't know what's going to happen, but let's assume, just because this is what I've been hearing from existing clients, that it's the worst case scenario and it could go up to 60%. Would that mean it's time to get out of China?
Well, again, it depends on which product you're talking about. So, I mean, there will be products where no matter how big the tariffs, pretty much, I mean, within limits, of course, China is still going to be the source
Right.
for these products. But there is a majority of products where if you make the tariffs high enough, it becomes unsustainable. And people will have to move out, and they will then have to figure out where to move to. And that, I think, is will be unavoidable if that indeed is the tariff level that we're talking about.
Right, right. The tricky thing about that is that we don't know which country will be slapped with tariffs next, So it could be China now, it could be Mexico tomorrow, it could be Vietnam. So it's tricky in that sense, You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. But then at the same time, since you don't know, we can't read the future, it might be good to stay partially in China while exploring other regions.
Well, I definitely have to be very careful, and this is the problem with our inability to read the political tea leaves, because it's easy for an administration to impose tariffs. You can do it in a matter of minutes. It's difficult for people to move their supply chain. That it typically depends on what kind of supply chain you're talking about, but it can take about 2 years
Mm-hmm.
and a fair amount of expense to move a supply chain. And so, keeping those factors in mind, again, it's not like buying products. You can go to a store down the street, and if that store closes, guess what? You can go to a store further down the street and buy exactly the same stuff at exactly the same price. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
So yes, you have alternatives, and there are the typical countries that are potential Plan B type scenarios are Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Thailand,
India.
India, the Philippines,
Yep.
and of course, much closer to home, Mexico.
Right. Right.
Um, so, and all of these potentially are excellent choices. But and then you have, of course, the ultimate, which is reshoring.
Right.
Bringing it back
Right.
to the states, which is a slightly different equation. But all these are very good potential sources. Again, depending on your products. If you make very large machinery-like products, you may want to move to Mexico because transportation will be a factor. If you're dealing with garments, you're going to think about Bangladesh, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
But typically, a lot of the made in China products have found a second home in Vietnam.
Right.
And again, a lot of people are saying, hey, I'm going to move to Vietnam. But part of the malaise that we're experiencing in geopolitics today is that is uncertainty. We don't know.
Right.
We don't know if Vietnam is going to be a target for big tariffs.
Right.
It could happen. We have no way of knowing. It doesn't seem to be knowable, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at history and you take that as a guide, and you say, well, tariffs were imposed on China because China is a communist country. If you take that somewhat simplistic approach, then why are tariffs not going to be levied against Vietnam? They're a communist country
Right.
too.
Right.
Not only that, but they used to be our enemy.
Mm-hmm.
So can you count on that as a solid source of products for the future? The answer is you don't know. It's
Right.
a risk, and
Right.
if you're going to take a risk, then as you said, you should be careful about moving too fast.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and therefore, I think a lot of companies are going to hold on to the certainty of their current supply chain, and keep some of their products in China, or the majority of their products in China.
Right. This has been my experience with existing clients. This is what I've seen. Michael, I think you know that one of our oldest clients, a large international energy company, explored Vietnam pretty seriously. And we accompanied them to Vietnam because they thought it could be a great alternative to China. And in many ways, it does sound very attractive. I think I might have mentioned already 40% of the manufacturers in the northern part of the country are Chinese owned. That is according to The Economist. Proximity to China, relatively low labor costs. So there's a lot of things that make it look attractive. However, on balance, when you compare the entire first segment of the supply chain from the raw material costs, many of which are still coming from China, and you factor in productivity, efficiency, lack of infrastructure, even though it's getting better at the end of the day, for many industries, you still can't beat China. So industry does really, really make a difference.
Yeah, no, I mean, typically Vietnam is about 15% more expensive than China. I mean, again, it varies from industry to industry. And if you slap 25% tariffs, suddenly Vietnam is in play, you know?
Right.
But uh, but then if you think, well, what if China changes? What if a new administration comes in and now the tariffs are 0%? Well, then you're back into China, you know, and this kind of yo-yo
Absolutely.
yo-yo system doesn't help importers very much. It's a challenge, definitely.
And it's very costly going back and forth.
Yeah.
So you did touch on Mexico. So, many companies have explored alternatives to China and Southeast Asia. Something else that's been very popular is nearshoring to Mexico. And I've been reading articles about little mini Chinatowns in Mexico. And so, do you think it might make more sense for companies? You had mentioned maybe with large machinery, Mexico might be a good option because of transportation logistics costs. Any further thoughts on that?
Well, again, the logic of Mexico is that it's both a gateway into an important market, which is the South American market, and of course a gateway into the United States, which is our sort of our main preoccupation at this time. So if you're going to make cars, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and you assemble them in Mexico at a low cost, it makes sense to do it there because it's literally next door to the United States, and you can transport them by road.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not the only one who thinks that. A fellow by the name of Elon Musk was ready to put a huge Tesla factory in Mexico. I think he might be having second thoughts because he's worried about Mexican, U.S. tariffs on Mexico, and yet he's not the only one. If memory serves, I think both Ford and General Motors have factories in Mexico. And not only that, but of course, then you've got BYD, the Chinese automotive giant, is planning to open a big factory in Mexico, which is obviously a bit of a fly in the ointment as far as geopolitics are concerned.
Right.
And maybe that deal hasn't been, if anything, that deal is going backwards right now. But all that speaks to the lack of certainty. Or, if Elon Musk doesn't know for sure whether there will be tariffs, who knows? Who knows?
And yeah, Michael, and previously, actually, we had heard also that the tariffs on Mexico could be significantly higher than those imposed on China, as high as 200%. Have you heard recent news on that? Any updates?
No, I haven't. I mean, again, the dynamics of the new administrations have only just started.
Right.
And we know that there is sometimes a difference between what is being said and what is being done. It's the word, yes, the number 200% has been made, but I think these kinds of punitive tariffs are meant to, again, that's my view, but they're meant to scare people politically
Mm-hmm.
and try to obtain some kind of cooperation, political cooperation
Mm-hmm.
with the new administration in Mexico. So, which is another, again, geopolitical factor is that you just don't have one new administration. In this case, you have two.
Mm-hmm. Good
So,
point.
you know, so, but again, you have this false economy of tariffs. You might make a very cogent argument that it makes sense to put a car factory in Mexico. And as I said, a lot of people have not only felt that way, but they went ahead and did it because the economy of that activity makes eminent sense. The only unpredictable factor is the political factor. In other words, what if coming out of left field, nothing to do with the cost of labor, the cost of transport, but with politics,
Right.
then, well, throw everything out the window. You can't predict anything anymore.
Right. Right. Okay, so we've discussed now two options. We've discussed alternatives in Southeast Asia, alternatives to China, now nearshoring. The other hot topic, something that people seem in the United States, some people seem to feel nostalgic about, bringing manufacturing back to the US, reshoring. And I know that is also very complicated. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on reshoring and if it's a viable option for companies, and if so, what companies?
All right. So let's agree that reshoring is actually the main motivation behind these tariffs, right? And it's been fairly explicit with certain people. We want to bring back manufacturing jobs to America. My personal view is that it doesn't make sense. You want to bring back manufacturing jobs. That sounds nice, but it's an antiquated notion. If you look back at history decades ago, the American economy was driven by manufacturing jobs up to a point. But even so, if you look at an interesting study from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, you'll find that actual manufacturing job contributions to the U.S. economy haven't really changed that much over 100 years. On the other side, what have you got? You've got unemployment. What are we dealing with? Are we dealing with 20, 30% unemployment in America? We need manufacturing jobs to keep all those people employed? No. We're dealing with the lowest level of unemployment that we've had in a long time. So that's not a need. What you've got is you've got an economy that is driven and one of the most successful, probably the most successful, not probably, for sure, the most successful economy in the world. And it's driven by service jobs and high-paying jobs overall, much higher paying than manufacturing jobs. If you're going to bring jobs back from China and still remain competitive, logic dictates that you're going to have to bring the same kind of jobs under the same terms in order to remain competitive. So what are you saying? You want the American worker to earn the same amount of money that the Chinese worker earns? Right. Do you want the 996 culture that you have in China to be exported to America? I don't think so.
I don't think that would be accepted. I think we should probably share what that means for listeners. 996.
Yeah, well, you know.
All right. So it refers to a culture, a work culture that is very popular in China and for a lot of companies, tech companies, and even I think manufacturing companies, where you work from 9 to 9, 6 days a week, which works out to be 72 hours a week, and you have one day off. I don't think the American public would appreciate that schedule.
Yeah. And I don't think their family would appreciate it if they were, if the other members of their family were in that system. It's interesting because the 996 is actually illegal in China. It's against Chinese labor laws, but there is a very strong spirit of enterprise in China, which basically means that people ignore that particular law, and you have a de facto situation where 996 is in place for a lot of Chinese enterprises.
Right. And I was going to ask you why it persists, but I think it's similar to what, working in New York or at a law firm was in the United States. Not now, maybe in some regions still now, but a decade ago, it was a rite of passage. You come in and you have a new job and you're going to give it your all and you're going to work 12 hours a day. And I still feel like a lot of Chinese culture, is very competitive and they want to prove themselves. Many workers want to prove themselves. And so they're willing to do it.
I think you're right. I think, well, I mean, we both you and I think agree on the ethics of hard work being a sort of a good thing.
Right.
Um, Americans are known to work harder, I guess, than Europeans who tend to value, I guess, their leisure a bit more. Um, and we think it's a good thing to work hard, but you also have in China slightly different dynamics. You know, first of all, you've got what I would dare call a burgeoning capitalist ethos. In other words, if you work hard, you make more money. You know, and that let, let's call a spade a spade. That's a capitalist ethos,
Yep.
and the other thing is you have a much different employment situation in China. So, you know, for the young people, you probably have something like 20% or more unemployment.
Hmm.
So you can see how that works in the marketplace of workers, because on the one side, you've got the employee who feels lucky to have a job and wants to hold on to it, make as much money as possible, as I said earlier. And on the other side, you've got the employer who kind of says, hey, if you don't like it, I got a long list of people who want your job. And so, even though that is technically illegal, it still is pretty much prevalent. And I would probably add that China is less, I would say, a country of law than the United States. So, you know, in the U.S. you have OSHA, you know, and you'd have people screaming and yelling at you if you started to do this kind of thing. In China, probably it's probably less of a factor.
Right. And just for our listeners, so they don't get concerned, I think that is true, a true statement. But as you know, and I think listeners should know that one of the things that we do for our clients is ensure, for many of them are concerned about labor practices. And so something that we do is go in and do audits at suppliers and manufacturers. So if that is something that you want to prevent, as meaning you don't want to buy from suppliers that have such an ethos of 996, then you can avoid it, but it does require people there on the ground to enforce that.
Yeah, and again, I mean, you be careful what you wish for. You know, you to a great extent, a lot of people are working 996s, and as long as they're compensated appropriately, who are we to tell them that they shouldn't do it? You know, you're correct. We tend to be very careful, and depending on our clients' views on corporate social responsibility, we will certainly help them ensure that the suppliers they're buying from adhere to their views. But again, in a lot of Chinese factories, this kind of thing is done, but it's not necessarily done. And I think this is where perhaps the misunderstanding occurs. It's not necessarily done in a coercive
Right.
sort of way.
That has been my experience of, I know people that have worked in factories in China, manufacturing facilities, and it is a choice.
Yeah, exactly.
So interesting about this whole reshoring topic. You kind of touched on higher costs, because essentially, unless you pay U.S. employees the same wages that employees in China are getting, it's going to be higher costs. There's also this consideration about resource diversion. So basically, if workers in the United States have to shift to do domestic manufacturing work, they would be pulled away from other industries where we, the United States, have been excelling recently, technology and services. So you would have this what is the word I'm looking for? This drain of talent from technology and service sector to focus on manufacturing, which doesn't seem to make sense.
Well, look, a lot of things don't make sense. Just the strict argument, again, this sort of romantic notion that manufacturing jobs is all about is what America is all about. It isn't. It's part of the American economy, and it'll stay part of the American economy for a long time. but we're not going to try and make t-shirts cheaper than the Indonesians or
Right.
the Pakistanis. Why would
Right.
we want to do that?
Right.
This is sort of an anti-trade point of view, which, again, in my personal opinion, is absurd. And and again, why would you want to take people who are trained to do, for example, coding, or they work in the AI industry,
Right.
and what, you're going to pull them and start working in factories to, to make gizmos? We have a hard enough time finding workers for agricultural jobs or for construction jobs because they
Absolutely.
don't pay enough,
Mm-hmm.
which, by the way, points to another geopolitical concern, which is called immigration, without which the American economy wouldn't function as well. So it's the whole concept of manufacturing is good for us is flawed from that perspective. But I recognize, again, the advocates of this point of view also say things like, well, you don't have to make quite as little as the Chinese workers make because you save on transport. But it's not a big saving. That is not a good answer.
Hmm.
Um, and, you know, a better argument is to say, if we in America don't know how to make stuff anymore, we become weak. Okay, so now you have a bit of traction, but that would imply that American manufacturers don't know how to make things, and I think that we're a long way from that to happen. There is an interesting hypothetical um, argument for reshoring, but it has to do with um, ultra modernity, if you want. And so you could some people do make the argument that you could have total robotic factories, robots coupled with AI that could make stuff cheaper than it is made in China. And again, in theory,
Hmm.
I think that's possible, again,
Yeah.
depending on the product. But we're not there yet.
We are not there yet. Right.
And
Right.
and how long will it take to invest into this kind of technology? Um, you know, let's put it this way: according to our current time horizon, um, we don't see that happening. And finally, I believe that trade is good.
Right.
It's good for the
Absolutely.
world. It's good for the
Agree.
people to interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
I buy from you, you buy from me.
Yep.
I buy from you what you make best, and you buy from me what I make best. And I
Absolutely.
think you know it's healthy to have a
Mm-hmm.
world where people interact, as opposed to let's try and make everything ourselves,
Right.
so that we don't have to deal with anybody. There's a word for that. It's called isolationism. It's not a good idea.
And it doesn't make sense, just practically speaking. One person, just an individual is not expected to be able to do all things. They focus on what they do best, their skill sets, and what is easy for them and hard for other people is typically how people find employment. So,
Yeah.
yeah, it would be difficult to assume as a country that we could do all things better than other countries.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's one thing to be proud and to say we
Of
could do
course.
all that,
Of
and and,
course.
and more power to you.
You could.
Yeah,
Doesn't
but
make sense.
but again, China has proven they can make a lot of products
Very well.
very well and
Yeah.
very economically,
Yeah.
and we benefit from that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's be happy with that, and focus on the reality of current times, um, which point in general conclusion to the conclusion that reshoring is very difficult and for the time being unlikely. And we've seen it because it's been 8 years since the first Trump administration, where the concept of tariffs and the concept of trying to coax people into reshoring was first elevated. And how much reshoring did we get? Right? You
Right.
just look at the numbers; they're
Right.
not there.
Right.
What you got is a fair amount of traffic went to other countries, including those we spoke about, Vietnam, etc. But
Mm-hmm.
not a lot came back on these shores. And that's just pragmatism. It's just the
Right.
way things are.
Right. Speaking of pragmatism, when speaking with clients, a very practical question is, when you're deciding what to do, asking them, and what are your competitors doing? I think that that is an important question. And so if a company's competitors are all staying in China, it might make sense to continue to stay in China as well. And vice versa, if they're all pulling out, I mean, it's just something to look at, something to consider. You don't want to be stuck having moved all your, supply chain to a different country, and then China all of a sudden, tariffs are removed and it's the place to be again.
Well, again, excellent point, Laura, because what you don't want to think is that, hey, tariffs are going to hit me, and by extension, nobody else. Tariffs are going to
Across
hit
the board.
everybody.
Yep.
So if you think you're going to become uncompetitive, it's usually because you're thinking about, compared to who you were today, with more tariffs, you're going to be less competitive than you were tomorrow, which leads again to the argument of inflation and everything else, because it doesn't make you less competitive compared to all your competitors,
No.
because all your competitors are faced with the same equation.
So it's a level playing field then, and they're
It's a
all
level,
asking the same questions. Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a level playing field. A rising sea lifts all boats and all that kind of stuff. But inevitably, when you think about, well, what do I do? Do I change countries and everything else? Got to keep another thing in mind, is that sourcing from China works not just because of pricing. It also works because of flexibility. And by that, I mean, China has built an infrastructure over decades now
Mm-hmm.
that delivers a very high quality output
Right.
in many, many different fields. And it creates great opportunities for a buyer. Now, if you're a big company and you say, I want those opportunities for myself, you could build a factory that will do that for you. That's a big investment of, it's a capital expenditure.
Right.
And suddenly now you're stuck with the technology that you invested in.
Mm-hmm.
If that technology changes, which is it tends to want to do in these times, things
Yep.
change all the time and rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
You bought all that stuff. You kind of feel forced to use it. But if you buy in China, you buy from the best supplier, and if your product ceases to get traction in the marketplace, you need to change it. You could buy it from somebody else, and next door another
Right.
Chinese supplier which has the technology that you need. If you have, for example, a product that works well and you want to improve it, China is perfect for you. One example that actually happened to one of our clients is, if you happen to be in the business of selling outdoor lights that are powered by solar panels,
Mm-hmm.
and you're doing very well with that product, and then one day you say, why don't we add wind power to this outdoor light system?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a completely different technology. But in China, you can get wind power and you
Right.
attach that to your
Right.
lighting system.
Right.
And again, if you now think, well, can I do that if I'm in Vietnam or in Thailand or in Bangladesh? The answer is no. You do not have that flexibility.
Right. Right.
And therefore, what matters the most to all enterprises, namely your ability to sell at good margins and to retain a significant percentage of your market share,
Right.
that ability is eroded by the lack of flexibility. Um,
Right. I
you
have
know,
been amazed over the years, working at CPG, with how nimble and adaptive China can be. And it was demonstrated during COVID. Not only is there thousands of suppliers in every industry, so you have many options, but you're speaking to this flexibility, adaptability, the ability to sort of pivot, add new product offerings when you want. It is pretty impressive.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And
So, Michael, we've discussed quite a few things. We should probably
yeah,
start wrapping it up so we don't keep people here too long.
yeah.
So, we are going to move on to the solutions segment. So, what we've been talking about so far, I guess, could be considered potential solutions, but none of them are a perfect solution. They're all things that people consider. So, again, finding alternatives to China and other parts of Southeast Asia, nearshoring, reshoring. But what are some practical steps, aside from moving your entire supply chain? What are some practical steps companies can take to mitigate the impacts of tariffs while also staying competitive? What are your recommendations?
Okay, so I see there, and I agree. We need to pay attention as much as this interaction is a lot of fun. We need to pay attention to time. So, for the sake of um, focusing on that rapidly, I see three specific solutions. Um, One is to negotiate better costs. Now, keep in mind, you're not alone in this game. Your Chinese supplier is going to feel threatened by these tariffs
Right,
more than you,
right.
frankly,
Hmm.
because you have the option to go somewhere else, but he's stuck with his factory, right?
Exactly.
So,
Hmm.
so they're gonna do their best to diminish the impact of tariffs for you, either by cutting their own margins or by negotiating with the Chinese government on some kind of, you know, price break that, a kind of financial support that the government might give, which again, under pressure, the Chinese government will. It has done that before, and it'll do so again.
Hmm.
Um, you may so the second thing to consider is to diversify without necessarily abandoning China. So, in other words, keep your options open.
Hmm.
Keep your solid supply chain in place. Don't
Right,
put that at risk,
right.
but also explore other opportunities. And again, that takes a bit of research, a bit of elbow grease. You need to go down there and you need to check out the realities from the point of view of three essentials: price, quality, and logistics. And if you find a solution, that is the smart thing to do.
Right.
Anyway.
And just let me touch on that just to share with listeners. We have seen, some of our clients have actually maintained their China program, their buying, but they actually shut down physical offices, their physical presence. So they sort of extricated themselves physically from China while maintaining the buying program. So, in a way, it's the best of both worlds.
Well, that's right, because they're in effect reducing their costs, um, and that helps their own bottom line. If you can, to a certain extent, managing your own office is a double cost. It's
Right.
it's an out-of-pocket expense, and it's also a management burden, which means
Absolutely.
the CEO of the company has to devote part of his mental real estate to controlling his China office, and that can be a burden.
We know all about that. Okay, so final. You said you had three suggestions, I believe. What is the last one?
Well, the last one would be to build resilience. Um, and depending on the industry that you're in, you got to look at the world the way it is, not the way you want it to be.
Exactly.
And there's things you can do, and they'll be different depending on the product. Let's be clear. But
Right.
in general terms, you may develop an inventory buffers. You should always look into contingency plans, which goes back to my concept of diversifying.
Hmm.
If things go bad, you've got Plan B.
Dual production capacities. I mean, it's kind of related to diversification, but
Yeah,
maintaining buying one place while also having other
yeah,
options.
yeah, and again, depending on the industry, you have part of your alternatives may be close to maybe involving nearshoring.
Right.
And again, some people, even though they're rare, but some people might benefit from reshoring. Bringing the production back home.
Right.
But typically, again, those things come at a cost. They take a bit of time. If you plan in advance and then things get really bad, that plan B suddenly comes into action, and it gives you an edge over your competitors, which again are faced by the same constraints.
Mm-hmm.
And if they didn't prepare as well as you, they're going to be hit by the full impact of
Right.
those tariffs, whereas you would have presumably been able to reduce that impact, and therefore you would become more competitive, and you might actually gain some market share.
Absolutely. Okay, so to close out, we have negotiate better costs, diversify without abandoning China, and then also build resilience. And we can go deeper into these topics probably in a separate podcast because we are going a little bit long. It's really good advice. Basically, what you're saying is a balanced approach. You have to weigh all risks very carefully before making any significant moves. Many options, but you have to think carefully and strategically.
And keep cool.
Keep
Don't.
cool. Cool as a cucumber, as you like to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, don't. Some people panic and run for the exits, but it's too early to do that.
Right. Agree.
That's what I mean by keep cool.
So you did touch upon industry, specific industries. And so since we're out of time today, I do think it would be interesting next time to dive a little bit deeper into the broader implications of tariffs on specific industries and for specific clients. So perhaps that can be our next podcast. What do you think?
Whatever you choose, Laura, I'll be happy to contribute.
Wonderful. So thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with our so many listeners, soon to be many listeners. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to CPG's Supply Chain of Thought podcast. Until next time, everybody, stay strategic and resilient.
Absolutely. And the whole thing about the supply chain of thought is that you can never, or you should never, run out of thought.
Things to think about. That's true. All right. See you later, Michael.
Nice talking with you, Laura. Bye-bye.
You as well. Bye.